Hello. Thanks for joining us today, or whenever you do join us, because we've had a few technical difficulties. But I hope you'll enjoy the discussion even so. I'm Michael Scott in the UK, and we're joined also by Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, who is my co-moderator of this jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford, and Campion Hall, the University of Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, across a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. Now, in a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is director of the Free Speech Project, and he will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion. Hopefully, we might have some questions at the end. And if you have been able to join in live, please send in your questions by pressing the Q&A and typing in the questions to us. These will come to me, and I will give them during the course of the session. So with that, I'll come back a little later on, and I hope we have a good session. Over to you, Sandy. Sandy, you're muted.
Very sorry. Thank you, Mike. I want to add my own apologies for all the technical difficulties we've had this morning getting started, and I appreciate the patience of those who are now joining us. We're very pleased about having this conversation about business ethics and whether they are a saving grace or whether business ethics are possible and are impossible, an oxymoron. I want to just introduce very briefly our panelists for today. David Jones, Member of Parliament from the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. We're very pleased that David was able to take the time to be with us. Patricia Harned, who for 15 years has led the Ethics and Compliance Initiative based here in the Washington area in the US. And then Frank Vogel, the sort of founding father in some respects of international transparency efforts. I want to ask everybody to be on the panel to be on mute unless speaking, because I think we're getting some feedback of my voice. So Frank is with us, and then Edward David from Oxford, from the Character Project, the intriguingly named Character Project at Oxford, and who is particularly concerned with business issues as well. I'd like to begin with David Jones. And David, a number of people have begun to suggest that perhaps because of lapses in ethical behavior on the part of the business and corporate sector and Western democratic governments, that perhaps this higher moral ground that we've always claimed to occupy may be getting sacrificed. And I wonder how you feel about that. We're asking you to be a representative here of international democratic governments and Western enlightened and ethical capitalism.
Well, I think that we've always rather overflattered ourselves in terms of our own ethical standards. I think that there has always been a strong tendency over the years for people to want to adhere to ethical standards, provided, of course, it doesn't cause any damage to themselves. That, I think, is starting to be eroded. For example, if you look at the UK recently, where we have had a strong push towards trading with China. In fact, George Osborne, our former Chancellor, was very, very strongly in favor of developing a strong trading relationship with China, said it was going to be a golden era of Chinese-UK relations. And that, of course, has come to a halt. I think that the government understand that one has to be very careful now when dealing with China. We've seen the Chinese become increasingly expansionist territorially. We've seen them adopting all sorts of methods. In fact, only today we hear that the Chinese State Security Department has been responsible for potentially hacking 250,000 Microsoft email servers around the world. And I think that governments are now becoming a lot clearer-eyed. So, for example, in the UK fairly recently, we announced that we would not allow Huawei equipment to be installed as part of our own infrastructure, notwithstanding that there are very few alternatives to Huawei, and notwithstanding also that that would result in a 2-year delay in our fully rolling out our 5G infrastructure in this country. So I think that things are changing, but we have to understand that countries over whom we have strong ethical doubts, most particularly China, have now got such a strong position internationally in terms of trade that it's very hard to put ethics wholly before national interest. And the consequence of that, of course, is that it turns us all into hypocrites.
A grim prospect, David. Please remember to mute yourself as we continue. Pat Harned, you conduct a nearly annual survey of the condition of global ethics, and I wonder what your most recent findings are. Are things as bleak as David Jones and I have suggested?
Well, that's right. We conduct a survey called the Global Business Ethics Survey. It's a longitudinal cross-sectional study of ethics from the perspective of employees in primarily private sector organizations, but as we know, in some countries, there's a fine line between private sector and public sector workers. We just fielded the most recent version of it. We fielded it 16 times since 1994. And the picture was not particularly worse, but not necessarily good. So one of the key metrics we ask employees is whether in the last 12 months, they've observed something that they consider to be a violation of their workplace standards or a violation of the law. And on average, half of all employees said yes to that question. Now, that was not significantly higher than what we've seen in the past, but it also wasn't lower. And certainly from our perspective, we've done a great deal of research to look at the impact of ethics and compliance programs, focuses on values in private sector organizations. We know that when it's done right and done well, it has a significant influence on conduct, especially in private sector organizations, but we're not seeing more organizations actually adopting those programs, and that's part of the problem.
Thank you, Pat. Frank Vogel, this is a slightly more encouraging answer, perhaps. Things aren't getting worse, is what Pat is saying, but quite a few years ago, you set out with some colleagues to start an organization called Transparency International. And just looking at the surface, it appears the concept has spread worldwide and people have been very enthusiastic. What impact have you really had on the ground on business practices and transparency?
The good news is that there are more initiatives in more countries to try to come to grips with improving business standards, business norms, than probably ever before. The bad news is that at the multinational, giant corporate, giant banking level, things are decidedly, in my opinion, getting much worse. Just so that the audience understands what I'm talking about, let me very briefly just give you one little story. Between 2003 and approximately 2010, hundreds of thousands of people were murdered and millions of people were raped and displaced and pillaged in Darfur in Sudan. At the very time that that was taking place, and when the International Criminal Court charged the then president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, of genocide and crimes against humanity, al-Bashir and his associates, working with BNP Paribas, one of the largest banks in the world and largest bank in France, was working with them to launder over $6 billion stolen from the people of Sudan. The bank totally violated US sanctions laws on Sudan. It violated anti-money laundering laws. It got away with it for a long time. It created phony banks. I could go into lots of details. At the end of the day, the French government never prosecuted BNP Paribas. The US Justice Department imposed a fine. Nothing ever happened to the executives at the bank. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. And ever since, we have seen vast money laundering. And frankly, most of the banks that engage in it have felt they have impunity and can get away with it. And too many Western governments have felt it's in the commercial interest, coming back to David Jones's point, to basically be complicit and supportive. I'll talk more about the national interest later, but it's just a vignette to show you this is going on. And don't forget, over $2 trillion a year of dirty money is laundered through the Western financial system every year.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Edward David, I want to turn to you because it sounds like you've got quite a task in the Oxford Character Project to look at, I think you have been known to say that you're looking at virtue in the business sector. And what we've had described so far does not sound very virtuous. So you've often written about these matters from a theological or philosophical perspective. What can you say here?
Yeah, there's plenty to say in terms of these ethical failures that we're seeing in the private sector, and especially in terms of large corporations and big banks. I want to come with a kind of optimistic view, though. So part of our project involves interviewing employees from all levels, from senior executives to graduate entry-level individuals at big firms. And what we're seeing is that there genuinely is this desire to partake in business in a way that's meaningful for the person. And there's a real sense on an individual level that, yes, I want to be involved in this big corporation or in this big bank and these financial activities in a way that actually adds value to society and also lives out my values as an individual. Now, I think where Frank and Pat's organizations come into the picture here in a good way is that actually big organizations need help in terms of assuring that institutions within those organizations and the culture at large are really supportive of the good intentions that individuals bring. I'm not 100% corporations have it right just yet on this culture level, but this is part of our task in the Oxford Character Project, is to suss out these ecosystem factors, if you will, that influence behavior on a psychological level from the deepest levels of one's character. And so I'm very encouraged by the work that Frank and Pat's organizations are doing.
I'd say that's admirable if you can feel encouraged. And I hope that it's true that the evidence is developing in that direction. I wonder, is there a general feeling among all our panelists, I'd like people to chime in here, that things are improving somehow? Pat, you've done, I believe you've helped 200 or so organizations look internally at issues. And I don't know if those have been matters of corporate culture or external behavior. Perhaps you could explain kind of on average what you've found.
Sure, I'm happy to. Some of the work that we do, actually the research we do through the Global Business Ethics Survey over time has yielded tremendous numbers of data points and metrics that companies make use of as benchmarks. So we do an awful lot of work trying to help them assess the corporate culture and identify drivers of either good or bad conduct in their organizations. There are plenty of instances where we have been brought in to help an organization after they've had a significant incident of non-compliance. They've been in trouble in big ways, and we've been brought in to try to help them think about culture change and regaining trust among their stakeholders. So for the most part, I think there are some commonalities. I appreciate greatly what Edward was just talking about, because I think fundamentally what we see is that the majority of employees are good people with good values who want to come to work and make good decisions every day. But it's the culture of their organization that can very quickly change that. And we've seen over time in our research that culture is driven by two things more so than anything else. The first is the tone that comes from the top, typically the C-suite, but also in a large multinational organization, the top where you are locally. The second biggest driver is your relationship with your immediate supervisor. And that person reinterprets the tone coming from the top depending upon the character of that individual. So for a good employee coming to work, wanting to work hard, wanting to earn an honest day's pay, to be a contributor to society, a toxic culture does a great deal of harm. And so that, I suppose, fundamentally sums up when we walk into lots of organizations that have had big problems. That's typically the conversation we're having, is the responsibility of leadership to be role models, to be committed to the values of the organization, to hold people accountable to it, but also for managers at all levels to realize the significant impact they have on the conduct of employees throughout the organization.
So that turns, this actually, what you've just said, Pat, turns on the head this notion that many people have had, that a lot of corruption, to use a simple word, can be blamed on rogue employees in an otherwise noble and moral corporation. It sounds the other way around. Frank Vogel, what is your thought about that? You need to unmute yourself, Frank.
Sorry.
You're remuted.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, the surveys that Dr. Harned mentioned, one of the things that they reveal, and I think this is terribly important, most people want to do the right thing. I'd also go further and I say most businesses are run by honest and ethical people. However, when we answer your question, let's think also of consequences. All these unethical actions have deep and broad consequences. When the top management of the Volkswagen Group agrees to manipulate engines in a way that produces false data and cheats the consumer, thousands and thousands of people bought diesel engines, Volkswagen cars, believing they were much more environmentally friendly than of course they were. That is really damaging. When the major financial institutions and mortgage companies issued subprime mortgages, millions and millions of people were cheated, and eventually, in many cases, their homes were foreclosed on them. So all of these unethical actions have deep consequences, and they are so often motivated. And here I go back to something David Jones said at the very beginning. What is the motivation here? And so often it's greed. It's personal interest. And the pressures today in the stock market from professional investment firms, from advisory firms, from hedge funds, private equity firms, and internally on companies to maximize short-term profit. And the enormous bonuses that company executives get when those short-term profits keep on going up and the share price keeps on going up are a huge incentive to dominate the culture, to influence what Pat said was the tone at the top. And we see this now, I think, at a multinational level in a really, really pervasive way. At the same time, I come back to this, a group that I chair called the Partnership for Transparency Fund, we're working with civil society groups in Ukraine, in Moldova, for example, to help them to monitor public procurement, to see that local private interests are not bribing governments to get contracts. And it's fantastic work, and it's getting great results because in Moldova, for example, half the funds allocated for COVID relief disappeared. So this is very actual, it's very topical. And there are courageous civil society people around the world who are countering these incredible greed-dominated forces.
David Jones, that's a grim perspective. And I wonder how you as a political leader assign responsibility for this. Is it a failing of education in advanced societies as well as developing societies? What as a political person, what do you advocate we need to do better?
Well, I think part of the problem is the question of what actually do we mean by ethics, because too often relativism will creep into the equation. And I'll give you an illustration. A few months ago, the chief executive of HSBC Bank appeared before the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament. HSBC is a London headquartered bank, but does most of its business in China and Hong Kong in particular. And the chief executive appeared before the committee basically to answer accusations that he had not been sufficiently robust in the face of Chinese actions in Hong Kong, anti-democratic trends within Hong Kong. He was criticized for the bank having frozen the account of a pro-democracy leader in Hong Kong. And his response was, well, I can't cherry pick which laws I should follow. And the point that he was making was, well, these actions on the part of the Chinese may well be unacceptable to a Western parliament, but that's the law over there, and that's the law that I have to pursue. And the problem that we have is, as I started by saying in this discussion, is that frequently people and organizations in particular will adjust their own attitudes to ethics depending on other wider surrounding circumstances. So I've no doubt at all that the chief executive of HSBC Bank is a fine man who wouldn't do anything wrong. But nevertheless, on behalf of his bank, he was quite willing to compromise what other people might have said were the sort of principles that should guide a bank in situations such as those that prevail in Hong Kong at the moment.
Yes, Frank.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I'm sorry, it's too tempting. I worked with two of the predecessors of this gentleman from HSBC, John Bond and Stephen Green. During the time that they ran HSBC, which was the largest bank outside of China and the United States in the world, their bank was involved in laundering money for the Mexican drug cartels, for a terrorist group in the Middle East, and various others, and they were hugely fined by US authorities. John Bond became Sir John Bond by the British government for his services to banking. Stephen Green became a member of David Cameron's cabinet and is now in the House of Lords. The fact of the matter is that time and again, as you said earlier, rogue individuals are blamed for these things. and the very top management is seen somehow or other to be above it all. They're part of this establishment. I've written a book which comes out in November. It's called The Enablers, and it's about the complicity of governments, including the British government, in pushing commercial interests so hard that they basically ignore a lot of these ethical corruption issues. And my final little point here is that comes to the question of what David Jones also said at the beginning about national interest. These issues are so big today that they have a major impact on the sustaining of democracy as the Russians and Iranians and Chinese take advantage of our corrupt systems and of our own security. And I would argue that's more in the national interest than the latest deal, whether it's for some gas pipeline into Germany or something else like that. We have to get real and understand ethics, bad ethics by big companies has enormous consequences for our society.
David, do you want to address?
Could I just jump back on that? I don't think that Frank is actually disagreeing with what I was saying. I know actually Stephen Green very well, and not only is he now a member of the House of Lords, he's also an Anglican priest. So the point that I was trying to make was that frequently large corporations, such as, for example, HSBC, can actually trim their own values depending on the surrounding circumstances. And that's why I come back to the question I asked, you know, what do we mean when we talk about ethics? Clearly doing something positively illegal is wrong. I think any business leader would agree with that. But the point that the current chief executive of HSBC was trying to make in his defense was that he was abiding by the law. I can't cherry pick which laws I follow. And that, of course, is the interesting question. Should he be cherry picking? Should he be refusing to do what the Chinese authorities tell him to do?
Edward David, as the ethicist in residence for today, what should that person do? And how do we prevent a pervasive atmosphere of cynicism about all this? And what do children grow up expecting from their elders?
Yeah, a few things. One is, David Jones brought up the point of ethics. Well, whose ethics? This all comes a bit relativized. And, you know, we have this UN guiding principles of human rights and business. And, you know, as much as rights language can be critiqued, there are still sort of guidelines that are useful in human rights treatises across the globe. Now, the point of due diligence that is in this these guiding principles is actually really interesting from a philosophical perspective. So if we think of rights as being sort of absolute, or there's a level of rights that are absolute, say to life, for example, due diligence suggests a bit of wiggle room, right? Like, well, as long as I took this into account, then I can still maybe do something else that might rub up against that set of rights. So I do have questions around the way we frame human rights and business engaging and being responsible towards human rights. I'm not quite sure, even with these frameworks, we're quite there in terms of really solid guiding principles. One final thing I'll say is we need to start early. Frank brought up civil society organizations. We need to educate for virtue in schools. We need to bring in community organizations together and really strengthen local social bonds. It's these local communities where we actually learn a vision of the good. And if we can't bring that up into our business places, if we disregard virtue and its development, I think we're very much up the stream without a paddle.
Edward, your mention of how we have to deal with this in our communities makes me remember the fact that I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I grew up not imagining that there was such corruption, that there were so many people doing the opposite of what they said we should learn to do. And I'm sure many people thought me naive when I came to the big city, as it were, and showed this surprise. You know, do you still think there are these values of honesty and ethics and straightforward decency? I'd like to ask Pat this as well. Are they still out there? Are they still there in maybe only in small communities or in other places? Edward, you first, and then I'd like to know what Pat thinks about this.
I'd say, yes, these values definitely exist. And I think what is necessary is when students are going through school, going through universities, especially at universities, where they're exposed to potentially different cultures, different careers, different vocations. It's learning from others, getting exemplars in front of them, getting your Pats and your Franks and your David Joneses in front of them, and really being vulnerable and open about what these struggles are that they meet in their spheres of influence. And when students can see this, see the real struggles, they can empathize and learn how virtue is actually operated and actioned in real life. Because you won't necessarily learn these in your small hometown. But once you start talking to people and expanding your horizon of a moral vision, then you can start to learn.
Pat.
I would echo what Edward just said. Actually, I got my start in the area of character development, working in schools, helping to write curriculum for teachers so that they could try to reinforce universal values among students. And Frank will remember this because he was involved with my organization when I first came, but it wasn't long before there was a transition for me personally and professionally into business ethics, where the concepts are actually not all that different. Fundamentally, for corporations to build and sustain strong cultures where people observe the law and avoid corruption, it requires the reinforcement, the articulation, the teaching and rewarding of conduct that is no different from what we're trying to do with young children when we're trying to teach them how to be honest and how to share. And the other observation I would offer is that we will periodically help companies revisit their core values as they articulate them, and field surveys among employees to get input about what should the values be that represent the way we want to do work. And when we do those surveys, there are always some variation of 6 values that rise to the top: integrity, honesty, responsibility, courage, transparency. You know, these are the values that people hold dear. I apologize, there's a trash truck coming down, very loud truck coming down the street. Hopefully you're not hearing it. So I do think, to Edward's point, there are universal values. Most companies, if they truly take a step back and look at what kind of work do we want to do, how do we want to succeed, in what way do we want to succeed, they'll arrive at those. But the problem is, back to Frank's point and back to David's point, that first of all, leadership is challenging, but power is very corruptive in and of itself. And so the higher someone rises in an organization, the harder it is, or the more intentional they have to be in surrounding themselves with people who will tell them no, people who will disagree with them. And that happens less and less the higher you rise in a especially global organization with a significant amount of money flowing in and out of it. And so I do think that even though a company may stand for very good values that should be making a significant difference in that workplace, it's also very easy to rationalize based on, we're a global company with lots of laws, which laws are we going to observe? It gets harder and harder to maintain that true commitment to those values. I still believe it can be done. I have seen it be done, but I also think that is part of the problem we're talking about.
You're muted, Sandy. Oh.
I'm the culprit, worst culprit of all. I wanted to say that we're going to go to Mike and explore questions that have come in just a moment. But due to our late start for technical difficulties, to which I appear to have contributed, I want to raise one other question. And very often in the United States, in the UK, in France, and some other Western societies that I'm particularly familiar with, the media are accused of being anti-business and not appreciating the contributions that the private sector make to personal wealth, to well-being in these societies. And it sounds to me from this discussion, the weight of this discussion, that the media have actually been easier on some of these executives than they ought to have been in some of these corporations. And it sounds, I mean, I run the Free Speech Project. It sounds like there hasn't been enough forthright speech on some of these issues as there should have been. So just if you could address that briefly, Frank. You yourself are a former journalist of some distinction and representative of the media. How did this happen under the eyes of some supposedly very careful and discerning members of the media?
It goes into two very distinct channels. Again, the good news, there are more people in the media involved in investigative journalism trying to root out unethical and corrupt behaviors, I think, in business than ever before. There's tremendous organizations like Global Witness based in the UK, ProPublica in the US, and many others dedicated solely to this. And I think they're doing a marvelous job. But a lot of the establishment media has basically done what so many of our governments have done and simply said, oh, well, an ethical lapse here or there in business, well, that's standard practice. That's the norm. Let's look at the corporate profits. So when you get a Goldman Sachs that paid $1.6 billion in bribes to float bonds for the government of Malaysia for $6.5 billion, of which $4.5 billion was then stolen by Goldman Sachs executives and other people like that. When it came to the quarterly profit statement, even though Goldman Sachs has paid several $billion in fines, and this is very recent, the quarterly profits of Goldman Sachs in the last 3 months were a record. And the previous 3 months, they were even higher. And the financial press is so awed by the enormous profits they're making that for them, the bribery and the corruption, that was just a footnote. And it barely got into the story, if at all. And so time and again, our financial journalists, the ones who really should be watching this, are totally caught up in this culture of profit maximization. What is the share price doing? What's the stock market doing? And I must say one other side. The good news, again, is that when it comes to issues like gender discrimination, diversity, sexual harassment in the workplace, there is more attention today by the media on these things and the corporate perpetrators of them than ever before. So it's a very mixed picture, but overall, the media, especially in the Western countries, needs to do far more. In many other countries, and I just give you an example of Brazil, or give you an example of South Africa, the media has been all over corporate corruption and all these unethical things and done a fantastic job in exposing it.
Mike, let's go to you for the questions and what some of the participants in the program have been saying to you.
Right, thank you very much. Thank everybody on the panel, and apologies to the audience that we started with some technical problems. That means that not everyone got the instruction that if you want to send in a question, you can do so on your Q&A button and just type in a question. It will come to me, and I can then give it to the panel. But some questions have come through. So the first one takes on, I think, what Frank was just saying a little bit, and it comes from Delia Ferrara Rubio, and Delia says, what is the silver bullet measure to prevent big gatekeepers from becoming corruption enablers? I think Frank's just been talking a little bit about that, so maybe I should address that to David Jones first. Would you like to take that one, David?
Yes, well, I doubt whether there is a silver bullet, because what we're talking about is people who are expert in finding ways of circumventing rules and legislation. I suppose the only answer to it is more legislation. Of course, I think both the US and the UK were rather late off the mark in introducing bribery legislation. In fact, the UK only came up with a bribery act in relatively recent years. But really, I really think we have to go back to Pat's point. Legislation will go so far. But the point is that people who do engage in corrupt practices probably know that they're behaving wrongly anyway. And they're probably willing to take the risk that they're going to go to prison if they're caught out. And I think that Pat's point that we need to adopt a culture in which become an anathema is probably the better way forward. But as for a silver bullet, I very much doubt whether it exists.
May I hop in? Thank you, David. I appreciate that. I would add, there is no silver bullet measure. I agree completely. But I do think that to the extent that it could be regulated, that companies share metrics about the strength of their ethical cultures, that will go an awful long way for us in understanding what's really happening in these organizations. Frankly, I'm surprised that the investment community, for as much as they are advancing the conversation about the environment and human rights and governance, they've not caught on to the fact that most corporations, large, medium and large organizations, but particularly multinational organizations, do gather information regularly about their cultures. And they have information that could be shared, maybe not all of it, and I'm sure there'd be significant pushback about it from the private sector. But the reason I suggest that as an important metric is that in almost every instance, and I'm sure Frank probably has thoughts about this, after a major scandal, we learn that there were employees somewhere in the vicinity of the wrongdoing happening that had some knowledge that something bad was taking place. And yet there was a culture where they did not feel they could raise the concern, or they did raise the concern and they experienced retaliation, so they just stayed quiet. And those are the metrics related to culture that if we could get to a place where there is a public expectation that companies are sharing some of those key metrics, it at least gives regulators and outside parties and investors, NGOs, the ability to try to step in and intervene when it appears that there are problems. But more importantly, I think what would happen is that companies would be aware that if they are not showing signs of maintaining a strong culture, they need to act fast. So that's just a thought, not a silver bullet, but certainly a key metric that would be worth trying to advance.
Frank.
Yeah,
please.
Just very, very briefly. First of all, it's wonderful that Delia Ferreira Rubio called in. She is the current chair of the International Board of Transparency International and probably would have a much better answer than me. I support all the answers that were just given, and I just make two tiny points. One, on Pat's point, whistleblower protection. Support for whistleblowers in corporations it's lamentable at the moment across the board. The intimidation, the fear that so many people who see things going wrong have about blowing the whistle needs to change. So many of the biggest corruption cases in the world have resulted from the courage of whistleblowers. So they need protection. That's part of the answer. But the second part, another part of the answer, a word not yet used in this session, is enforcement. If the only punishment that corporations get is a rapper on the knuckles and a fine, don't forget, not a single chairman of a major bank that perpetrated the subprime mortgage frauds in the United States, where millions of people were victims, not one of them was ever prosecuted or taken to court personally. So long as there's no enforcement of the top people, we're going to see this situation get worse at costs to our democracy.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got a question in from Rachel, who's a graduate student at the University of Michigan. Hello, Rachel. Thank you for sending your question in. How do you think capitalism, and especially capitalistic markets in a digital world, impact the pull between individual versus social responsibility? She goes on, in today's isolated world with strong economic competition and exclusion to disadvantaged groups, what makes people care about one another? I wonder whether, Edward, you'd like to have a go at that, please, as does she, actually.
Yeah, very an excellent question. I mean, one way to approach this from a philosophical perspective here is, I think in our capitalistic culture and what some might call a hyper-capitalism, we've kind of made fictions about what people are. So people are either sort of profit maximizers, or maybe from a legal sort of fiction, we are persons that have all of these rights, and we need to get these rights fulfilled. These sorts of fictions that are sort of inherent to a hyper-capitalist worldview, I think that very much influences how we think about ourselves as individuals and how we think about others. And I don't think this influence is necessarily a good thing, right? We start thinking about our own self-interest as opposed to the bonds that we share with other people. Currently, we're seeing a kind of renaissance of classical thinking, which may be kind of categorized as post-liberalism, a theory that doesn't reject individual rights, but wants to embed the individual back into social bonds. I think there's a lot going for this, and a lot for that worldview that really views us as actually socially connected, as having not just rights, but responsibilities towards others.
Thanks for that. Mike Collins from Georgetown, as many of you all know. Hello, Mike. He says, if no one at the highest levels goes to jail, then fines, no matter how large, become simply a cost of doing profitable business. Why has there been no personal accountability for serious and ethical behavior? David, do you want to take this one?
Yes, thanks, Mike. Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true. I mean, I remember Nick Leeson, the man who brought down Barings Bank a few years ago, being sent to prison for, I think, about 5.5 years. But I take the point, and Frank has made the point earlier, that the punishment always appears to be a fine, which, relative to the size of the corporations we're talking about, can frequently not be that severe a penalty. I think it's important that people should actually pay a personal price if, in fact, they indulge in unethical behavior. And I don't think that Nick Leeson should be the only one who's sent to prison. I think that there are a lot of other people probably enjoying life today who should be in prison as well. And that is the sort of sanction that does need to be adopted if we're to have real enforcement of the legislation that does exist against unethical conduct.
Would you agree with that, Pat?
I do agree with that. I do think part of the problem has been the way enforcement has happened, that if corporations, it's becoming an increased practice for monitors, independent monitors, to be brought into corporations and deferring prosecution, which does allow some people who are wrongdoers to go unpunished in some cases, not in all. To David's point, there are plenty of executives who have had consequences. But I would also add that a lot of the work that we do is walking into organizations after prosecution, after enforcement. And I will say that there is a significant influence on the employees who remain in the company when something very bad has happened and put the company in the news. There's also reputational damage. And I do think we're increasingly in a time where the investor community, the employee population, they're getting much more bold about pushing back when their companies are doing wrong. So if anything, I'm optimistic that we'll see more accountability coming from some unexpected places. And it does make a difference in those organizations.
Thank you all. Oh, Edward, yes, come on in.
I'll just say quickly, I think there is an ethical pedagogy to litigation and to prosecution. So if we don't prosecute, if we don't engage in litigation of these corporations, then even if those top executives kind of get away due to deferred prosecution agreements or due to clawback clauses or whatever the case may be, as Pat said, there's still these repercussions. There is a moral lesson that's learned by others, and hopefully learned by those who will then become executives in their own time. So the litigation, no matter how imperfect it is, I think it still serves a vital ethical component in this.
Thank you for that. Two questions have come in. One anonymous, just asked, does the law reflect ethical behavior? And one more specific from Chimanonso Ibakri, regarding newly proposed EU due diligence law on human rights and environmental standards, what is your advice on how companies should prepare in regards to compliance, particularly US companies? So the first question was, does the law actually reflect ethical behavior? And the second question, it relates here to a new EU law. Perhaps David might. Sorry, Frank. Yes, please.
I just want to jump in. You know, I think this is all well and good. But let's be real for 1 second. When you get the biggest banks in the United States provide, and real estate associations providing over $1 billion into the last election round in the US, when you look at the scale of the lobbying that is done by the major corporations, when you look at how close the leaders of major corporations are tied in to the political and business establishments of their countries and the influence they have, these enablers, that's the title of my forthcoming book, these enablers are part and parcel of a whole system where they basically get impunity, and everybody knows it. The British House of Parliament issued a report last year called simply Russia, where basically they said there's only a limited amount we can do about what goes on, and they also acknowledged that the City of London and all these financial entities all make a lot of money that produces tax revenues for the British government. Therefore, actually, it's really not so bad. The system itself is complicit, and the enablers in the system at the top of many of these big corporations are explicitly using it to protect themselves and get away with things that we could call questionable. And when you look at US defense companies, just as an example, at the degree to which they lobby to sell arms to thoroughly corrupt authoritarian regimes that mean us no interest, and they get away with it and they get permission, then you can see just how bad the system works. And finally, a very recent survey by Transparency International in Europe and numerous Pew Research surveys in the United States show the public at large is disgusted by the system. They see corruption in government, in their own governments. And why? Because the power of the enablers to lobby and influence, and as a result, just get wrapped minor fines. So it's not a judicial issue. And I just would add for the UK, and David Jones can talk more about this, the head of the British former serious fraud squad said, we don't have a budget to prosecute many of these people because they hire the most expensive lawyers in the world. The litigation costs are too great. We have to be extremely selective who we choose. So when it comes to even enforcement, the British government, the US government is not providing the money to actually do things. And there are judges, just for your first question, who would love to see prosecution, that have even gone public and written about the fact that there should be prosecutions. The cases are never brought to them. Thank you.
Can I go to you, David? David, back to you.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Well, I agree with a lot of that. But one point that Frank made then was that the public are absolutely disgusted with what's going on. And I really do wonder whether the public, frankly, ought to be rather disgusted with themselves. Because the truth of the matter is that we continue to buy goods manufactured in, for example, China. I'm sorry to talk a lot about China, but I think it's a very good example of what these ethical problems are these days. We continue to buy goods made in China, in some cases because China has now developed a complete monopoly on those goods, or because they're cheaper. And frankly, if the public were really disgusted, they would actually boycott those goods and refuse to deal with countries such as that. And this comes back to the whole difficulty that we have when we engage in discussions of this, is that we are all relativist in the way that we view ethical problems. It's always a problem that this corporation isn't enforcing its own ethical standards, or this government is turning a blind eye. Whereas the fact is that each and every one of us is engaging in this hypocrisy, and it can't be called anything else when it comes to ethical standards. How many of the people listening to this call wear a pair of trainers or sneakers manufactured in China, even though they may have doubts about the conditions in which those goods are being produced? It's all relative. And frankly, the sad fact is that we're all to a greater or lesser extent guilty of a lack of adherence to proper ethical standards.
This is, again, a very interesting and strong debate here, because it seems to me that it's getting a debate about our democratic systems as they are, and about communication of those systems. As a Shakespearean, it reminds me of Macbeth. And you'll remember in Macbeth, when Lady Macduff calls her husband a traitor, and her son says, "What is a traitor?" And she says, "Those that cheat and lie." The little boy says, "Well, why don't the cheats and liars gang up against the good people and hang all the good people?" In other words, you get to a position of nihilism because of the leadership that has gone wrong at the top.
And if I may,
it's there within the play. I've got some more questions. I just see this. We're getting into a kind of no solution except through communication, or except through politics and our democratic politics. We've got to find a way through this, because if we don't find a way through this, it's like the environmental crisis. But we have found a way through the environmental crisis because the people are on our side on the environmental crisis. They are answering the call to stop buying things or to change their way of life. But this is corruption at the very highest level that we're talking about. Frank,
And
James,
Mike,
Sorry.
I just wanted to add, it brings us back to where we began, really, in some ways. And when David Jones said we exaggerate our virtue with the rest of the world in Western democracies sometimes, but one understands the skepticism with which we're viewed after we hear some of this conversation.
yeah. We're going to be coming to the end, but there is a question here from James Vencelauskas. So I forget the pronunciation wrong, James. How can accountability be achieved in a way that produces long-term positive impacts? That is, how can the social and economic order incentivize good behavior, penalize bad behavior to produce public consciousness? I mean, James is asking the question. It's at the back of all the debate today. And I think we have to go back to our philosopher here, Edward, to start us off on that. But maybe we'll get an answer for that one from everyone else. But Edward, would you like to have a go at James's question?
James's question and one earlier about does the law embody ethics brought up in my mind St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of law, which let me just read it to you super quickly. So law is nothing other than a certain dictate of reason for the common good made by them who have care for the community and promulgated. So a dictate of reason for the common good by those who have authority. You know, when we talk about an economic order that incentivizes good behavior, when we talk about laws that enforce good behavior, or at least have some sort of enforcement mechanism, sitting at the heart of this is a notion of the common good. And as I think you said, Mike, earlier, you know, as part of the solution, communication. And I think that's 100%. In this globalized world, we need to communicate to each other, to share our needs with each other, to know the needs of others, so we can empathize with these needs and try to develop systems, an economic order, legal systems at the local levels in the first instance, and also international level as well, so that we can come to a vision of what the common good actually is, in order that actually serves those in need. Without this sort of communication, cooperation, or coordination between institutions like Frank's and Pat's and politics and the public or the private sector, the common good can't be realized. It can't be seen. It can't be pursued.
Thank you. Pat, do you want to have a go at this as a final statement, really?
Well, Edward gave such an excellent answer. I'm almost afraid to follow on to what he just said. I guess I do know that in corporations where employees do not believe that there's accountability when someone oversteps the rules, regardless of their level, that breeds an organizational culture where people don't report problems, but also you start to believe, well, I can just do what I want to do because I'm not going to get in trouble for it. So the accountability piece is essential, both within an organization, but on a broader societal level. But I still come back to the importance of organizational values, the importance of prioritizing culture, the importance of actually incentivizing leaders in corporations, and frankly, in government agencies in all sectors. Incentives for leaders to actually set a proper tone, to be a good role model, to hold people accountable. Those are actions that actually do make a difference. But I think it has to be applied not only to the private sector, but also to the public sector as well. That connection between the two, we're not going to solve the problem by just focusing on one.
Thanks very much. Frank, final word from you.
Well, thank you for this marvelous discussion. Let me just add, because I support everything was just said. I'd like to go back partly to something Edward said earlier about youth. There are a whole range of Transparency International chapters that are doing youth programs. And it's so important that young people understand, have a good sense of values, understand civics. And so I think that's part of the component. The other part that I want to emphasize is we're living today in a world where the tendency towards authoritarianism in more countries in the world is greater than ever. And it's been accelerated by the way in which governments have taken advantage of the COVID pandemic to lock down, to suppress the press, to suppress civil society. So I would argue in the most general terms, we need to do everything we can to increase the space for civil society and for free media right across the world so that we can hold those in power, business and public, to account, that they can be held accountable, that their actions can be seen by everybody. In other words, that there is transparency. But right now we have a crisis of restricting journalists, restricting civil society. And we need to address that very explicitly and mobilize forces to change that so that indeed we can hold power to account, which I think is at the core answer of what we do about business ethics and more generally government ethics. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. Let me now go to David, and I'll just say that David is a backbencher these days, though he was a member of cabinet at one point. As a backbencher these days, is known for holding people to account. Famous for that. So perhaps David, you'd like to say the final thing.
Well, yes. By the way, I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, so thanks very much. It's just a shame that we didn't have the audience with us at the beginning. But I'm attracted by what both Frank and Edward have said. I certainly think that we need to ensure that people are held to account and are seen to be held to account. But the more important thing, I think, is also to ensure that values are inculcated in people, that people understand from a very early age that it's right to do certain things and it's wrong to do other things. And as Edward said, communication is so important. But the big concern that I've got is that these days, where we're able to communicate as we never have been in the history of our civilization. We're holding this meeting today where people on either side of the Atlantic are engaged in a very stimulating conversation without any huge problems. But the fact is that we're doing this on a platform provided by an internet company. I'm not sure which platform it is, but that is the way that communication is conducted these days. It's conducted online by and large. And every time we sign up for a new internet platform, we're signing our souls away. We're making sure that these companies can actually harvest all our most intimate data, and they can sell it to the highest bidder. So even when communicating with one another, we're actually engaging unknowingly in practices that some people might regard as suspect at best, and in some cases, sadly, as corrupt.
Thank you very much. Sandy, I'm going to bring it to a close in a minute, but a final words from you, please. When you're unmute, Sandy.
Yes,
Thanks.
just to reinforce what David Jones has just said, we are treading in some ways on very shaky ground. And I think what Mike and I have tried to do in this series is to approach problems that are not just in one country, but are international problems. And on the theory that if we talk about them together with a broad audience, and we've tried to reach out across the world, that maybe we'll come to a common will to find solutions. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'm grateful to all of you for your participation. Sorry again for our technical problems at the beginning. Those will be attended to. But I hope people will continue to join us in these conversations. Thanks to Mike and to Blackfriars Hall for the cooperation we get there. Thanks to Georgetown University for supporting these international dialogues, particularly Tom Banchoff, the Vice President for International Affairs, and Jack DeJoy, the President of the university, who has encouraged us along this path. And we're grateful to all of you for joining us. Back to you, Mike.
Yes, well, thank you, Sandy, for simulating the stimulating discussion that you've chaired. Again, my thanks to David Jones, Patricia Harned, Frank Vogel, and Edward David. It's been a terrific debate. Our apologies to the audience who came in late because of a technical problem, and for some who didn't make it, and I hope they do make it on the recorded version. And we'll try to see what we can do to make sure that they get access to that recorded version as soon as we can. Thanks to everyone at Campion Hall and at Blackfriars and at Georgetown, as you've said, and thanks to those of you who sent in questions right at the last minute. And I'm sorry that there were even some at the end that I couldn't have time to ask. So apologise for that, and we'll see if they might be able to be answered by text or email. The next free speech project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event, in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, will be on Monday, the 23rd of August at 11 a.m. EST and 4 p.m. BST, when we will be discussing the issues relating to free speech and religion. And God willing, we won't have a problem at the beginning of that one. And then we've got more coming up in September, a really challenging one in September as well. I'll keep you on tenterhooks for that. Thank you all for attending. Please join us for the next event, 23rd of August. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, thanks to all our panelists, thanks to the audience, thanks to Sandy, and goodbye. Have a good evening.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye.